My grandparents own a home somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains. As my parents and I were the closest living relatives to them, we of course had more time to visit them than anyone else in the family, and we did so. I wouldn't consider our family rich or high class of any kind, but it always felt like a luxury going to my grandparents', as I suppose it does for most people. The home was very well taken care of, despite being in our family for many generations. They were your typical loving grandparents. Grandpa was a gentleman to all, and would always tell us grandchildren stories of his younger days, and my grandma was the best cook on my dad's side of the family. The house itself was still of average size and make. It consisted of a large living room, a small kitchen, a decently sized dining room, a garage, and a hallway that led from the dining room into 3 different bedrooms, a bathroom, and one other room at the very end of the left side of the hallway. This was the storage room, where my grandparents kept old pieces of furniture that they couldn't find any other place for. The room was also occasionally used for hiding presents from the children during Christmas season. But for the most part, all that was in there were items so ancient they've lost their purpose, appreciation, or both. Because of this, sometimes I couldn't help but feel this sense of emptiness and abandonment whenever I stepped into that room. But apart from that, there was one thing that would stick out to anyone when stepping through there. On the wall, directly across from the door, was a clock. It was a standard early 1900s wall clock, with Roman numerals all around its edges, and the hands still worked as well, surprisingly. However, the strange thing about the clock was that it had an extra numeral. Directly underneath the 12th numeral was XXV, the numeral for 25. Whenever asked about it, my grandpa would always tell the same story, that an old friend of his had it made as a joke. Apparently, back when he and my grandma were still newly married, he would often go out on the town with his friends, and he would promise to grandma that he'd be back that night. Apparently, he'd often get back right after midnight, and grandma would get on him about his promise. He would then claim to have kept it, not paying attention to what time it actually was. And grandma would always gesture to the clock and say, "Oh, I didn't know there were 25 hours in a day now." Despite the random extra numeral, the clock still seemed to work how any other clock should, not even acknowledging the 25th hour. Occasionally, one of the grandchildren would very innocently ask if the clock really did stop for that extra hour. I remember asking that question myself, and my grandpa simply chuckled and said, "Of course not. It's for display only." However, it wasn't like we could go in there after midnight and watch the clock remain still for that extra hour anyway, because my grandpa always had that door locked past 11 until 5 or so in the morning. Now, of course, anyone would be naturally skeptical about that, but as a kid I never questioned it and just learned to accept it, and everyone else that was close in the family respected the rule as well. However, things would change when I was around 7 years old. My grandparents decided to hold a family reunion at their home at the end of the summer. There was a group of cousins that were quite distant from the rest of the family due to living all the way in New York. Because of this was the first time 2 of the youngest of those cousins met Grandma and Grandpa. One little girl, Millie, was only 2, and the other one, Peter, was 10. Of course, as another boy cousin around my age, I immediately tried to befriend Peter, and welcomed him as best I could. But due to being so distant from the rest of the family and living in a completely different area of the country, Peter was not what I expected him to be. He wasn't outright mean to me, but he definitely wasn't as warm and friendly as others in the family. He was quiet and more cautious around the rest of us, and I'm very positive I had to have been somewhat overwhelming for him when we first met. I could tell for the few times we hung out together during the event, he wasn't exactly thrilled to be with me. However, at one point, the family was having yet another barbecue on the back deck, and Peter randomly sat next to me, which was odd because he normally sat next to his mom. where he would quietly play on his DS. At one point, while eating, he leaned over to me. "Hey, so why do you think they do that with the door?" he suddenly asked me, speaking barely above a whisper. "Do what?" I asked, although I immediately knew what he was asking about. I assume he at some point saw the clock and heard the story about it as well. "That room with the weird clock. Why do they lock it at night, hmm?" I don't know. It's just always been like that. You've never thought about why they lock it? There's gotta be a reason. Think about it. They have a clock with an extra hour on it, and they just happen to lock that room just around when that hour would come in? Part of me wanted to ignore that theory because, as a kid, I really didn't like the idea of my grandparents lying to me about something. They were probably the biggest source of honesty I had ever known at that point, and I simply didn't want that to be untrue. But very soon my mind began to probe deeper into the thought, and what could be hiding in the seemingly impossible time frame. "Why would they lie to us?" I asked Peter. "Adults lie about a lot of things, dude," he responded. "Tell you what, you want to sneak in there tonight before they lock it?" But, I mumbled back, worriedly. "We'll just go to bed early so they think we're asleep. Then we'll get to stay up and do whatever we want." The thought of pulling an all-nighter was a new but exciting idea to me, and I began to lighten up to the idea. And so, in our naive anticipation, we began to plan our little stakeout for the hidden 25th hour. We started listing the things we would bring to the room. I merely suggested bringing snacks and a couple of toys, while Peter planned to bring his DS and sodas to keep our energy levels high throughout the night. More and more I got excited for this event. We eventually pretended to go to sleep around 8:30 and decided to watch a movie to keep us occupied while we waited for the perfect time to launch our infiltration into the storage room. Finally, the time came at around 10:50. All the other family members in the house were either in bed as well or chatting in the dining room or living room. We made our way down the hall with our bag full of supplies. We got to the final door, and Peter carefully twisted the metal knob until it clicked way too loud for our liking. Because of that, we made haste opening it and headed inside. Once we were inside, I felt that subtle but ever so present feeling of abandonment again. However, this time it seemed to be mixed with something else. I had never been in the room that late at night before, and the darkness made it even more unpleasant to be there. I couldn't figure out what the feeling was, and even now it's hard to put it into words, other than the feeling of misplacement, like we weren't ever supposed to be there, as if we were disturbing a tomb. I looked toward Peter, and even in the darkness, I could at least sense his uneasiness. Before long, though, we did our best to push that sensation to the back of our minds and hype ourselves up again. We arranged our blankets on the floor between an old desk and an armchair, which were up against the same wall as the door, so if anyone, for whatever reason, opened the door, we wouldn't immediately be found. Peter immediately opened his DS and booted it up, while I retrieved the sodas and snacks that we had snatched from the kitchen. Right away, I began to dig into the licorice bag, while Peter pulled out a bag of potato chips beside him and cracked open one of the soda cans. 10 or so minutes went by, and we could hear, presumably, our grandpa arriving at the door to lock it for the night. For a moment, we grew tense and muted our chatter and noisy snacks, and listened as the lock shifted into its position within the door. The sound only reinforced my uneasiness. It wasn't like we couldn't unlock the door from our side anyway, but the idea that there was no going back for the night made me feel more like I was out of place here. Rainfall outside became audible through the windowless walls of the room, and the faintest murmur of thunder echoed behind it. We kept quiet for a few minutes before resuming our fun, and for the next hour Peter and I simply talked about whatever while I watched him play on his DS. We finally began to bond for a bit as we talked about our interests and tried to find out what we had in common. Overall, the night was pretty joyful and filled with laughter. but it was still always hindered by that never-ending, unpleasant feeling that lay underneath, and as our eyes adjusted to the dark, it became easier to make out the clock, and much to my dismay, I began to drift off into a slumber as the clock ticked past midnight, despite all the sugary food we'd been consuming. Peter, on the other hand, wasn't having as much of a problem, and we agreed that he would wake me when the hour began to approach. I felt a little bad for forcing Peter to stay up alone with his thoughts and the uncomfortable feeling that the room casted on us. But my young body became ever more exhausted and longed for rest. And so I finally made myself more comfortable and let the storm outside hum its lullaby to me. After what felt like only 10 minutes for me, I could feel myself being shifted as Peter finally woke me for what we had been waiting for. This was made easier as the storm outside had grown much louder than before, and now immense cracks of thunder were heard every few seconds. When he saw I was fully awake, he pointed to the clock, which had reached around 12:58. Even after all this time, it never dawned on either of us the absurdity of this whole ordeal, of waiting to witness a time of day that didn't exist, but because of our juvenile naivety, the anticipation remained apparent. "You ready?" Peter excitedly whispered. "Of course I am," I responded, equally as giddy. The minute hand had now reached the 12:59 mark, and after hours of quietness, our ears were alarmed by the oddly loud noise of a lock jiggling. Our heads snapped in the direction of the door like birds spotting a predator. Peter instinctively lowered himself flat against the floor, closed his DS, and gestured to me to do the same. I got down, tense as I've ever been, and hid as much of my body in my blanket as possible, and tried to make it as flat as I could. The door, after a few tediously long seconds, finally opened gradually. A fluorescent white circle invaded the room. My grandpa followed right behind it, holding the flashlight that cast it, and traveled to its very center, closed the door, and relocked it. Fortunately for us, he never moved the spotlight from the center of the room, and barely looked around at all. He then turned off the flashlight and, rather hurriedly, lowered himself onto his knees. I could hear him lay the flashlight on the floor, as well as another object that sounded much more different, but I couldn't quite tell what it was made of. The silhouette of my grandpa remained motionless in that position for what felt like even longer. The thunder outside was nearly constant at this point, and it sounded as if the storm itself was pounding on the roof of the house. Once again, I tried to focus on the clock, which was nearly done with the 59th minute. I began to brace myself, not knowing what I was even bracing for. And then, finally, tick, 5, tick, 4, tick, 3, tick, 2, tick, 1. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The storm had completely stopped, and instantly. It didn't fade out or anything like it normally would. It was as if it was just playing on a speaker that got cut off from its power supply. In fact, there seemed to be no outside noise whatsoever. No wind, no distant cars, not even the natural creaks and groans of the rest of the house. I could barely see it, but I could tell on the clock we had finally entered the supposed 25th hour. Because of the silence, my heart began to beat so hard that it was hurting my chest, and I honestly thought it would be loud enough that my grandpa could hear it. About 20 agonizingly quiet seconds went by, and I finally noticed the window that had appeared. It was centered on the opposite wall to our corner, so it was directly to the right of the door. The window didn't seem to let any light into the room, which is why I didn't immediately notice it. But I could see out of it pretty well. At least, I thought I could, because there really wasn't much to look at. As previously mentioned, our grandparents lived in the mountains, and it was pretty far into the wilderness, and it would have been easy to spot some trees that surrounded the sides of the house. However, there were no trees to speak of. There seemed to be a few hazy particles drifting past the view, but that's it. After a good while, I finally broke my gaze from the window back to Peter, and he looked exactly how I felt, mostly tucked away under his blanket. I could still see his eyes as wide as ever. I don't think I've ever seen such terror in my life, and that in turn raised my stress levels even further. My head shifted back towards the window and my grandpa as I heard him let out a sigh that anywhere else would have never been noticed, but in that silence, he might as well have been screaming. There was a weird shakiness to it, and it seemed to struggle to leave his mouth. More deathly quiet minutes dragged on more than I could handle, and I even considered announcing our presence in hopes of easing the discomfort that we all for certain felt, and to finally break the painful silence of that room. Before I could decide, however, something did break it. From outside, a faint rhythm of sounds danced throughout the room and onto my ears. Like the simple footfalls of a person, but they sounded much heavier. The rhythm became more and more clear. My grandpa never looked up in response, but he did begin to squirm and shift himself around as he became more and more tense. My heart sank when I looked out the window and I could finally see a shape coming into view. As it got closer, it somehow began to cast a shadow into the already dark room. The shadow was a shade of darkness that I didn't even think was possible. I nearly gasped when something got pressed up against the window. It was hard to tell at first, but it looked like the palm of a hand. The hand only had 2 fingers that could barely even be considered fingers, and were more like flappy, triangular extensions of flesh. The hand began to feel around the window until the 2 fingers anchored themselves at the bottom and began to lift the pane of the window. Then, the rest of the body began to make its way through. What came through that window shouldn't have been able to with as much ease as it did. Standing just a few feet away from my grandpa was something unlike anything I'd ever seen. A gaunt, towering figure, at least 8 feet tall, stood completely upright in the room. Its gangly arms nearly reached the floor, and its feet, similar to its hands, were each tipped with 2 triangular fleshy toes. As it stepped into the room, its feet made the floorboards gently creak under its weight. Its tall, pointed head was slightly pressed against the ceiling due to its height. It didn't seem to have a face, but its cone-like head looked as if it was split in half with a seam running down from the top of the head to its base. Even though it didn't seem to have eyes, I could tell it was purposely looking down at my grandpa, who looked like a child compared to the thing. He still refused to turn his head up. In fact, it seemed like he tilted it down even more to avoid looking at the monstrosity before him. Using his left hand, he fumbled around the area near him for a few seconds before lifting something up above his head, showing it to the creature like an offering. I could tell now by the silhouette that it was a large chef's knife. My mind raced when I saw it, and tears started to well up in my eyes as I fought back every urge to scream or even gasp in horror. My grandpa lowered the knife back down and finally tilted his head up to the creature. I could tell by his stuttering breaths that his mouth was open. The knife jittered in his hands as he angled the blade towards himself. I nearly fainted as I watched my grandfather plunge the knife up into the roof of his mouth. He began to gasp and quietly wail in agony, while he attempted to force the knife further into his mouth. All while the creature stood there, still and silent as ever. I could barely see the small pool of blood that began to form around my grandpa and the creature's feet. After a few more painful seconds, he yanked the knife out, throwing it to the floor and nearly collapsing. After pausing and catching his breath, he brought his hand up to his mouth, still leaking with blood, and stuck 2 fingers inside. He strained for a bit, and slightly rocked back and forth as if trying to pry something from his mouth. This proved to be true, as eventually he yanked out a small mass of flesh. He held it carefully between those two fingers and gently lowered it onto the floor in front of him. Shortly after, the mass began to move, and soon, it stood up. It was around the size of a small bird, but other than that, it was unmistakably a complete replica of the very creature that towered over him. The large creature finally moved again and kneeled down to look at the thing that just came out of my grandfather. The baby creature shakily waddled towards its larger counterpart like a toddler. The large creature then picked it up with a set of smaller arms that I couldn't see before due to them being folded up against the creature's chest. I was finally taken away from the horror I had just witnessed due to Peter. He had begun to retch at the disgusting display. This was immediately noticed by both my grandpa and the creature. As my grandpa turned, I locked eyes with him. I had never seen my grandpa show any form of fear, but I also had never seen anyone portray such horror as I witnessed my grandfather portray in that moment. I could tell Peter had finally reached his limit, as I could hear vomit trickle out of his mouth and splatter onto the floor. In response, the creature let out a deep gurgling sound and stood upright once more. It began to mutter a series of complex, gurgling noises at my grandpa, like some otherworldly language. A language that he seemed to understand perfectly.
What? No, I didn't know. I swear.
He began to plead to the being.
No, please, don't hurt them, please. Please leave them out of this.
The thing proceeded to gurgle and point at him accusingly. At this point, he had stood up and backed away from the creature, both out of fear and an effort to protect us from whatever the creature intended to do to us. Both Peter and I finally rose up from the floor and backed ourselves as far into the corner as we could. The infant creature still remained nestled in the secondary pair of arms of the giant, like a baby Joey, and simply watched the whole ordeal with no visible emotion. The first creature let out a few last gurgles and snorts at us, which caused my grandpa to react even more terrified than before.
What? 2? No, you can't give me 2. I can't take 2.
The creature silently gestured behind him and towards me and Peter. My grandpa snapped his head towards us and then immediately backed towards it.
No, absolutely not. Not them. You keep them out of this.
The creature never responded, but instead turned back towards the window and bent itself downwards as if to leave. It reached one of its arms out and fumbled at the ground outside before settling it on something. It brought its arm back inside, and with it, a tall, glaive-like weapon in its grasp, angling the blade towards my grandpa. It began to slowly walk towards him and threatened to pin him against the wall with the blade. It spoke a few more phrases which seemed to change his mind. He raised his hands in surrender.
Please, no. All right.
I finally felt the need to speak aloud to my grandpa with tears pouring down my face.
Grandpa, what's happening?
It's okay. You're going to be okay. Just do what I say, all right? Peter and I refused to answer that question in such a worrying and distrustful situation. I looked back at the creature and I noticed that while it still held the glaive in its hand, in its right hand it held 2 dark, oval-shaped objects the size of ping-pong balls. It held them out with its horribly long arm, and my grandpa gently grabbed them from it. He then rested one of them on the floor, while the other one remained in his palm. Then he pushed it up to rest between his fingertips, before planting it into the same place he had cut into his mouth. He forced it in through more staggered breaths, and it seemed even more painful from the previous process. Finally, he picked up the second arm and the knife, before approaching us with the most sorrowful look on his face.
Boys, he muttered, I need one of you to do something for me, please.
It was obvious, but I knew neither of us would conform to committing the same heinous act ourselves. We both began to cry even more, and begged him not to make us.
Please, boys, I'm sorry, but you have to, or something really bad will happen. Please.
No! Peter cried.
No, 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 no! I want to go home! I want to go home! Peter rushed out of the corner and to the door, frantically trying to unlock it. Peter, no! Before my grandpa could reach him, he finally yanked the door open, not paying attention and swinging it into my grandpa's face. Blood started to gush out of his nose. I couldn't see Peter from behind the now open door, but I never heard the sound of him running out of the room either. Instead, I saw him slowly back away and into my view again. His face was completely lifeless. It was like he was a machine. The only thing I noticed were his hands, practically stuck to his sides, but they were shaking. Both my grandpa and I called to him to try to get some kind of response, or at least a sign that he was still alive. After about 10 seconds of nothing from Peter, his arms finally began to move as he brought his hands to level with his face, which remained deadpan. Then, after unleashing the most haunting scream I have ever heard from a human, he began to claw his own face away. His body still remained completely unmoved while his hands continued to dig away at his face. At that point, I had turned my head to face the wall, weeping into my hands. As I tried to block everything from my vision, I had thought that surely my grandpa would step in to restrain him somehow, but I never felt him leave my side to help Peter. Peter would continue his agonizing song of unknown pain for what felt like forever. Eventually, I could hear the footsteps of the creature over the vile screaming. Whatever was happening, it caused my grandpa to finally intervene, as I heard him scramble over to Peter and begin pleading once more. I regrettably looked again, and could see that my grandpa seemed to finally be fighting against the creature, albeit futilely. The beast had picked up Peter with its giant two-fingered hand. He now lay completely limp in its grasp. His mouth still hung agape and still emitting that horrible screeching. My grandpa clinged onto one of his arms, desperately trying to pull him away, but the creature simply wouldn't have it. It yanked Peter upwards, causing my grandpa to be flung forward and landing at the thing's feet. It nonchalantly kicked him away like he was just a pesky animal. Even with how light the kick was, it still managed to send my grandpa back to the wall with a painful thud. Peter finally ceased his wails of terror, probably only because he had completely diminished his voice. And so the creature backed up and began to exit through the window as silent as it entered, taking the glaive, Peter, and its horrid infant with it. Once it was outside, it slid the window back down, sealing it as if it was just a polite visitor. Both my grandpa and I remained on the floor, both sobbing. I stayed in that same corner in the fetal position, tucking my face into my knees while my grandpa was kneeling again, but this time hunched over and pressing his face onto the floor. He spent a long while like that, and it had certainly felt like it had been at least an hour already. But maybe that was just me desperately wanting out of this silent hellscape. I finally looked back at the clock, that dreaded clock that brought us here. I couldn't see it well through the dark and my flooded eyes, but I could at least tell that it wasn't even a fourth of the way through the hour, probably not even past the 10-minute mark. This whole ordeal had played out in less than 10 minutes. How can something so tragic, so ruining, happen that fast? I had finally begun to ask my grandpa, through sniffles and gasps of air, why this was happening. It took him maybe a whole minute to will himself to push himself off his submissive posture, and even longer to face me with his absolutely broken gaze. There was not a semblance of any emotion other than despair etched into every feature of him. His lips quivered, and it seemed like he had forgotten how to speak. There was only one thing he could say, and it only came out as loud as a whisper. I'm sorry. It would take perhaps another 10 minutes before he could finally begin to somewhat explain this whole thing, but it wasn't much. You won't understand a lot of it, but all you need to know is... He paused and calmly began to scan the floor around us and fumbled around before returning his gaze to me and lifting his hand holding something. It was the strange orb the creature had presented to him before. If we don't take care of these, only tragedy will come for us. I glared at this object in his hand. My mind went back to what my grandpa had pulled out of his head just a while ago. The gangly infant, baptized in my grandfather's blood and saliva, a fully living entity that emerged from a simple cut in his mouth. I didn't notice my grandpa calmly using his other hand to take mine and hold it out, placing the orb in my palm and wrapping his own around it before patting it with his other hand. I began shaking again as I heard him fumbling around in the darkness with something metal. I could now see the now red-stained knife resting in his hands in an offering gesture towards me. My gaze jumped between the knife and the orb multiple times. Finally, I made one last glance at my grandpa and, for the first time since we entered this room, he smiled. A warm and reassuring smile, trying to tell me that it would be fine, that it wouldn't hurt. Without removing my eyes from his face, I reached out and placed my hands on the knife.
The minds of children are interesting, to say the least. Despite their more limited knowledge of, well, everything, they seem to compensate by having the most unique and creative ideas for how the world works, such as the idea of a large, ancient man that sneaks down your chimney to deliver gifts, or that there are monsters in your closet, or in this case, the idea of a clock that ticks to an hour that doesn't exist. However, although these ideas, with how ridiculous they may seem, they are, for the most part, not without reason. And in some cases, the child may have a point.